Coming Around Again by Gwyn Chapter 5. The dog days had come early that August. In the apartments run up along the river road, people sat on their stoops and fanned or leaned on windowsills, hoping, they said, to catch a breath of fresh air, as if the air, like everything else with promise in Manessa, had to be caught before it got away. In Emily Hilton's third-floor flat, however, it seemed as if the heat was an invited guest. This evening she had cooked a hot meal for Lute and his friend. Hot, steaming potatoes, hot short ribs, hottish biscuits steaming string beans, and glasses of tepid sweet lemonade with which to ease them down. She wanted to show those gents what a good hot meal was. She wanted them to stay. After all that, Lute had not appeared. There was only Bonus Schaffer, a man she did not know, sitting across from her at the dinner table, stiff with good manners, running his index finger around and around inside his collar to let the air in, and picking at his food. Already sweating and uncomfortable when they sat down to dinner, he had produced a large bottle of elixir of life and set it by his plate. "For my bowels," he said, gravely, producing also 2 large liver-colored tablets, some Diona pills, he confided, to put a balance in the bile. "Elixir of life," Ruth read, sitting next to him, causing him even more discomfort by reading over his shoulder his medicine bottle. "A great cure from the Orient," she read, "from the wise Chinaman. Succeeds where all else fails." "Will bowel problems kill you?" Sarah asked. These days she ruled all of her existence by a physical measure. "Sarah," Emily looked at her. "Is that a dirty word? Anyway, he said it first." "Bowels is guts," Ruth said, making them sound dirty. "Maybe the wise Chinaman could have helped with those kittens," Sarah said, eating with great ceremony 1 green bean. "Kittens?" Emily asked over the steaming bowls. "Nothing," Ruth mumbled, kicking out under the table for Sarah to keep her quiet about those kittens, and Bonus looked down, startled to see what kicked him. "Sorry," Ruth mumbled, and Sarah giggled. For dessert there was to be a cake, a chocolate cake made out of hoarded chocolate, oleo, eggs, fancy flour, and sugar. Ruth and Sarah had admired that cake all the afternoon. They testified to its excellence as they licked the bowl. They could even stand to eat a hot meal with that cake ahead of them, waiting to be consumed. Now Emily had decided not to wait on Lute. "Would you like some chocolate cake?" Emily asked their guest. Bonus looked at her, startled that anyone should ask him to eat such a thing. "No, no," he said, through thinly veiled anathema. "I never do eat cake. It don't agree with me." And after saying so, he took instead 2 measured tablespoons poured of elixir of life. "Does that really help you?" Sarah asked skeptically. From the smell she could imagine the taste. "It does." "You don't get sick at all? Not colds or anything?" Ruth asked, about to run her finger along the side of that chocolate cake, to have a taste of the icing anyway. "I've never been sick a day," Bonus said, "since I've taken the elixir." "What about the other stuff?" Sarah said. "Those other bottles of medicine, what do they do?" "Sarah, now don't get personal." "But, Mother, his side of the spare room is all bottles." "Sarah, that's enough. Help Ruth clear the table, Sarah. We'll just have to save the cake for later." "Yes, Ma," Sarah said, hang-dog and disappointed. She helped Ruth clear the table. "Will you take coffee, Mr. Schaffer?" Emily asked. A pot of the stuff steamed on the back burner of the gas range. No, thank you," he said, looking at his watch, while around him, wordlessly, their faces damp with the heat, Emily and Ruth and Sarah cleared the table. Then there were steps, footsteps coming up the stairs. "Lute!" Bonus said, brightening. That must be Lute. And Emily hurried to the door, turning the stair lights on as she passed the switch, and Ruth and Sarah stood together in the brown shadow those lights cast. They were expecting the worst. They were expecting Mrs. Toohey come to judgment about those kittens. But it was only Clara and George Watson on the top steps, cramped and sweating from the climb and dressed as if they didn't know what heat was. "My, it's hot," Clara Watson said on her entrance. "It's terrible, terrible hot." and she took a Lady Day magazine off the entrance table and fanned with it. "Lo, kittens," she said, absently, to Ruth and Sarah. She took in the lone man sitting at the dinner table, just as if he belonged there. "We were just about to have dessert," Ruth told her. "Hey, chocolate cake!" "Chocolate cake!" George Watson cried when he spotted it. He mopped his forehead with his handkerchief. "You've been giving old Boney here a big welcome, I hope," he told them, as he picked up a chair and turned it so that its back was to the dining-room table, straddled it, and slid some of the chocolate icing off the cake onto his index finger. "Because he is Clara's husband, and Clara's Emily's best friend, he has proclaimed himself their man, now that Jim is gone." He licks the icing off his fingers. "Ain't seen hide nor hair of Luther, I expect," he said, giving Bonus the high sign, the sign men give to other men who are in the know. "George and your brother Luther goes back a ways. Did you know that?" Clara said, helping Emily to reach down some more cups and plates. "Mr. Schaffer, that is, Bonus, mentioned it," Emily said to that. "Small world, isn't it?" Clara offered, looking expectantly towards her husband, who sat before the cake, waiting for his cut with his index finger in its icing. Still a pretty woman, Clara liked to be introduced to her husband's friends. Clara Watson," she introduced herself finally, offering Bonus her hand and smiling. "That fellow there is my husband, Bonus Schaffer," Bonus said, blushing. He took her hand and pumped it once. They had not taught him much about how to apply to a lady's hand at the Peaburg Foundling. "I'll bet you didn't even know he had a wife," Clara said, smiling, standing above him. "When he's on the road, I believe he takes off his ring." "Sure you knew I had a wife. Didn't I tell you?" Soaker winked at Bonus when he was sure Clara couldn't see, showing only Bonus that he really was the same old good-timer who had never let on that he had a wife. "Sure, I knew." Bonus is embarrassed. Though he says what Soaker wants, he feels the lie. "Sarah, Ruth, bring up some chairs now. We're ready for the cake," Emily said. "Ruthie sits by me," George Watson said, grinning, patting Ruth as she brought over her chair. "You know, Emily, I fear we are the bearers of bad tidings tonight," Clara confided, just as the first slice of cake was about to be cut. "About Luther?" Emily kept her face a polite mask as she handed the first slice to Bonus Schaffer. Their eyes met about Luther. "It ain't so bad." George gave Clara a look. The look says it wasn't so bad. "Clara likes to bring on them gray clouds, them little storms," George said. "You know what she's like, Emily. Well, if Luther Trout being fired the first day on the job ain't bad enough, suppose you tell me what is," Clara replied, getting on her high horse now. She forked at her piece of chocolate cake, avoiding the icing. "I never said he was fired, Clara," George Watson corrected her. "I said he was let go, because you can't fire a piece worker, Clara. You can just let them go." And then he leaned onto the table and stage whispered, "You don't get that cake sliced quick, Emily. Me and Ruthie is going to take over and do the job for you." Ruth, with George Watson's arm around her waist, was helping herself to the icing on their side. "Now, Ruth," Emily warned. But Ruth knew she wouldn't do anything about it, and swiped another drabble of icing off the side. "Is Lute in any kind of trouble?" Bonus asked. This was the first time he had anything to say. His stomach felt so heavy on him he had trouble thinking of anything to say. "Trouble?" George paused, chewing. He had got his cake. "You mean when he was let go? You mean you ain't heard? Shoot, that story was the gospel in the yards all afternoon. I thought for sure you had heard." "No, I got a place on the line," Bonus said. "Lute went on for another job. Lute pulled a young drowning boy out of the river. Lute's first day on the job, and he goes and plays the hero. Our Luther sure don't let no grass grow." "But you said he was let go," Emily asked. "How could that be, then?" She put a slice of cake in front of Bonus by mistake. "The safety record, Emily." George made a comical face with his cheeks stretched over a mouthful. "You know the safety record." Emily was quiet at that. She knew about the safety record at the yards. "Was anyone hurt?" Sarah asked. "Did anyone die?" "No, no one was hurt. We just have to watch our accident record nowadays," George Watson said expansively over his crumbs. "We can't have any more accidents on our record." You mean that because of Jim's accident, Luther was let go? Oh, God. And for a moment, Emily just looked, big dark eyes looking up at the light. Then she put her hand over her mouth. See what you've done? Oh, George. Clara shook her head at him. Come with me, Emily. Come with me, she said, holding Emily by the shoulders and pushing her off, propelling her down the long hall to the bedroom, the place where women weep. Shoot. George looked after the two of them, shaking his head. I ain't never seen anyone who could turn it on like Emily can. Help your mother, Bonus told Ruth and Sarah so severely they thought something must be their fault and went off after Emily and Clara without complaint. George watched the girls clear. You know about Jim and all? He asked. I suppose you know all about that business. I do, Bonus said, running his finger around the inside his collar to let the air in. He was feeling very uncomfortable now because of all that he had eaten. But how could he have said no to Emily? You really don't know anything about what Luke did today? He wasn't playing possum or anything? No, I really don't know, Bonus said. That's all he could say. The kid he saved was Silver Susie's grandson, George Watson told him, and leaned back, waiting to see what Bonus thought about that. Bonus shook his head. He didn't know what George Watson wanted him to think. Well, Susie's got a place down by the river. I don't want to have to draw you a picture of what kind of place. It's that kind of place, if you understand me. I understand, Bonus said. I know what kind of place it must be. I tell you, Bonus, George Watson shook his finger in the air, that Luther Trout will be lucky to get out of that place in one piece. Susie's girls will be so warm and grateful. I swear that he was born under a lucky star, that one, George Watson grumbled, licking the cake crumbs off his fingers. Well, you certainly let the cat out, Clara said, coming back into the room. You would make the angels weep, George Watson. Shoot, Clara. It's like walking on eggs to say anything around here. It ain't like Jim died yesterday, after all. Do you think I should tell her about Ruth and Sarah now? About what they did? Clara consulted with him. I don't want to kill the poor creature with misery, even if she should know. Tell her, George lowered his head, swashing his hand over the tablecloth, getting the crumbs together. Better you than some others I could mention. And when Ruth and Sarah came back to the room, a little late because they had been poking around again in Bonus's things, there was a feeling that made them stop and stick close together outside the light where the brown shadows danced. Ruth, Sarah, now what about those kittens? Emily said from beneath the light, her eyes red-rimmed. What do you mean? About what kittens? They deadpanned at her. Clara, Emily commanded, tell about the kittens. Mrs. Fremont, that is Vice President of the Episcopal Auxiliary, says she found you two playing funerals on your father's grave. We weren't playing, Mrs. Watson, Ruth said, and gave her a look. Well then, I just don't know what to think, Claire spoke back, now on her high horse. Poor Mrs. Fremont thought it was some kind of a satanic ritual when she saw there was bodies. We thought we were going to have to call a doctor. The poor woman was that stricken. We didn't do anything wrong, Sarah said, but her mouth trembled. Ruth nudged her not to cry. What did you do? Sarah, tell me, Emily implored. Her eyes dark pools of sorrow in her white face, her hand lifted up into the light, drawing Sarah out. We buried some kittens, Sarah said, beginning to snivel, though she was trying not to. Tears at a moment like this were hard to stop. They died, and so we had to. On your father's grave? Oh, Ruth, you buried them on Jim's grave? Ruth swallowed. I didn't think he'd mind, she said clearly, losing her resolve. Now her eyes, too, were full of tears, full of those damned tears. And where did those kittens come from? Claire Watson put in. And, like Ruth and Sarah, she was outside the light, so all they clearly could see of her was her mouth, her red and speaking mouth. Those kittens that you buried. We stole them, Ruth said warily. Old Mrs. Toohey wanted to kill them, and Roger Toohey didn't gas them enough to kill them, so he took them. We thought we could save them. Then she broke. She could not keep from crying. Emily in the light took a deep breath. You might just as well have stolen money, Ruth, as stolen those kittens from Hannah Toohey. She's that foolish. And then to bury them on your father's grave. Oh, Ruth, what can I do with you? What am I going to do with you? You could show this Mrs. Toohey. Bonus spoke over the ribs and the rolls and the beans that he felt were boiling in his belly. You could take the woman over to the grave and show her where you got them buried. He looked around. He was in the light, trying to see through the light to the girls. She wanted them dead after all, didn't she? He asked through the light. Now they are. Hell's bells, Bonus. George Watson clapped him on the back on that one. Clearly he had enough of the tribunal by now. You are Solomon, Bonus, a second Solomon. That's the ticket, George said, looking from Clara to Emily. Ruth, you have to say you're sorry and offer to show her where they are. There's your solution, Emily. I'll write a letter, Mother. A letter of apology, Ruth said, palming the tears off her cheeks. I promise. Old Jim's probably glad to have the company of them kittens now, Emily, George Watson said, and shouldered up in the light. Come on, Clara. We got to get going, he said, mopping his face. For a moment they all recognized that it was hot in the flat. It was terribly hot. But what about the gun, Mother? Sarah put in. We can't give that back or apologize because we don't know who it belongs to. Gun? You didn't go and steal a gun, Sarah, Clara Watson said. I found it in the cemetery, Ruth said, giving Sarah a scowl about the gun, which was supposed to be a sworn secret between them. You bring it to me this instant, Emily said, standing and holding out her hand. Only her outstretched hand was in the light. This instant. So Ruth had to go and get it. What else could she do? And it was the center of attention when she put it in the light, in her mother's hand. Woo-wee, George Watson whistled when he saw it. Now that is some shooter. Where did you say you found it? Clara asked. In the cemetery, Sarah said. Ruth fell over it. Boy, oh boy. George held the thing up and sighted along the barrel. Some kind of a crook must have dropped it. This is a serious shooter, Ruthie. It's not anything to play around with, he said. Still, he pretended he was aiming it at something. I don't think it works, Ruth said. It's dirty and rusted. Have a look, Bonus. What do you think? George handed him the gun. Bonus turned the thing over gravely. It's a military sidearm, a Colt, he told them. The officers carry this kind of a Colt. Now all eyes were on him. He was in the war, George said. Boney here, he won the Great War for us. Let me have a look at it, Emily said unexpectedly. Bonus passed the gun across to Clara, who took it as if it were a dead rat, and handed it to Emily. What do you want with the awful thing, she asked. I never held a gun, Clara. Emily took the thing and held it up in imitation of George Watson's moves, sighting along the barrel. This is some shooter, she said, playing it big. Now stick 'em up, your money or your life. There was a laugh at this, though Ruth and Sarah were secretly shocked at the way Emily was playing with the serious shooter. Still, they laughed. Are you sure it's broken? Are you sure it won't go off? Show me how to work it, Emily said, gesturing to Bonus, pointing the thing at Bonus, but getting all of them to come with her out the back door to the little wooden porch attached to the fire ladder. Phew! It really does smell terrible, Ruth. Beyond them, in the hills across the river, in the night, the slag went over. Fire fell in the night. That's how you would hold it, Bonus showed her. That's it. Who shall I shoot? Emily asked, aiming the thing into the darkness. Mrs. Toohey, Sarah said. The Peaburg Trust and Guarantee, George said. Herbert Hoover. Mrs. Toohey, Sarah said. Bang, 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 Emily said, shooting for the gun and laughing. Anyone else want a turn? Me. Let me. I want a turn too. Ruth and Sarah clamored for their chance at the shooter. I want it, Claire said suddenly. No one's going to say I was a sissy about an old gun. And she took it from Emily and aimed it into the twilight. Now that's right, Bonus told her, putting her arm up. Clara wrinkled her nose at its feel. Now who shall I shoot? She cried. Mrs. Herbert Hoover? Bang, Clara cried out, never pulling the trigger. Now who else? Me, George Watson cried. Go ahead and shoot me, why don't you? Shall I? Clara looked at him. Shall I shoot you, George? Shall I make myself a rich widow? And she pointed the gun at George Watson. Her head turned a little away from the gun as if she expected the sound, the bang, to be real this time. And, as luck would have it, this time it was real. The trigger went in and the gun went off. Scattering dirt and noise, it went off. And though it missed her George, and the bullet buried itself in the porch just over his head, it was a real shot, real as anything. "You got any numbers money left, Clara?" George Watson asked, when he got his voice back. "I think it's time me and Bonus went down to the hot spot to cool off a little."